Welcome to Medicine with a Fork, a clinician podcast produced by the educational nonprofit Gaples Institute, whose mission is to advance the role of nutrition and lifestyle in medicine. I'm Jeanette Brooks, and today we're talking fermented foods. We're going to cover not only what they are, but also why they offer health benefits to you and your patients. With me is Dr. Stephen DeVries. He's the executive director of the nonprofit Gaples Institute, and he's also a faculty member at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Hey, Steve.
Hey, Jeanette. Great to be with you.
Yeah, I'm so glad that we're talking about this. So, Steve, let's start our discussion today about fermented foods with a simple question. Scientifically speaking, what exactly is fermentation? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Fermentation happens when bacteria convert the natural sugars in food into acidic compounds, and the most common one is lactic acid. Lactic acid accelerates the growth of the beneficial bacteria that drive this fermentation process, while at the same time, they suppress the harmful strains. The result is really, Jeanette, an ingenious way of preserving foods. And it's fascinating to recognize that fermented foods have been used for centuries and by nearly every culture around the world as a way of preserving foods.
Well, that is really fascinating. And I'm curious to know more about how the bacteria are used to start the process. Can you speak to that?
Sure. It depends on the specific product. But when it comes to fermented vegetables, like pickles, sauerkraut, and kimchi, the process usually works the same way. The vegetables naturally contain bacteria, often called lactic acid bacteria, that can metabolize the sugars inside them into lactic acid. And that's what makes these foods tangy. Fermented vegetables are usually soaked in a salty brine, a solution that allows the lactic acid forming bacteria to thrive. And at the same time, the salty environment keeps harmful bacteria, the ones that could spoil the food, from propagating. Now, for yogurt, bacteria are typically added to milk, and those are often lactobacilli, to start the fermentation process. And for kefir, which is a drinkable type of yogurt, a special type of kernel that includes a combination of bacteria and yeast, and this kernel itself is referred to as a kefir. It's added to milk to start the fermentation process. So it produces the drink that we call kefir, which is a tangy one that I personally enjoy.
Yeah, me too. And really great to know that it's so beneficial. So just to recap then, it sounds like for vegetables, the bacteria is there already. And then for fermented dairy products like yogurt and kefir, it's something that's added in the process.
Exactly.
Okay, so it sounds like fermentation has been around for a really long time as a food preservation method. But I want to go back to what you said earlier about how it can play a role in patient health. Let's talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. There's growing evidence that a healthy gut microbiome, which is the ecosystem of microorganisms in our digestive tract, it's closely linked to overall health. And so the most obvious connection between fermented foods and health is that these favorable bacteria and fermented foods contribute to this diverse ecosystem in our microbiome. But there's a lot more to say about the benefits of fermented food other than the addition of the bacteria themselves to the microbiome. For example, a landmark study published in the journal Cell found that individuals who regularly consume fermented foods had both a more favorable microbiome, like we've been talking about, as well as a reduction in inflammatory markers.
Okay, that's really interesting, especially considering how inflammation is known to be such a significant disruptor of patient health.
Exactly. And fermented foods are just one of the many ways that diet can help reduce inflammation. But another benefit of fermented foods is that they can actually aid in digestion. For example, individuals with lactose intolerance often find that dairy foods are better tolerated if they're fermented. The reason is that the bacteria involved with fermentation also help to break down lactose, which is why products like yogurt and kefir actually have lower levels of lactose than other dairy products. So fermented products may also help make some dairy products more accessible to those with lactose intolerance.
Interesting.
And yet another benefit of fermented foods is their role in vitamin production. The byproducts of bacteria in fermented foods include vitamin K and specifically vitamin K2, which is an important regulator of calcium metabolism. There's some very preliminary data that fermented foods may also have a favorable impact on cognitive function, likely mediated by, as we talked about, suppressing inflammation, this time neural inflammation.
Wow, that's really amazing that there are so many benefits. It's almost what doesn't fermented foods help.
You're right.
So you made that really clear about how fermentation involves these helpful active bacteria. I want to ask another question because there's another food preservation process that I've always assumed was similar to fermentation, and that is pickling. But now that you've explained fermentation, it sounds like pickling might be quite different from fermentation. Is that right?
Pickling is a very broad term that describes the preservation of food in an acidic environment. Now, that acidity can either be produced by fermentation, like we've talked about involving live bacteria, or simply by adding an acid to the mix, usually vinegar.
Okay, vinegar. So do the foods that are preserved in vinegar have the same health benefits as the fermented foods?
Not really. The acidity in vinegar preserves the food, but vinegar doesn't support the growth of the bacteria needed for fermentation. So vegetables bathed in vinegar don't have live bacterial cultures, and for that reason, they don't have the same health benefits associated with fermentation.
Okay, so sounds like the live bacterial cultures are the key. Thanks for explaining that difference between fermenting and pickling. That was a question mark in my head. Now, the million-dollar question, though, and this is a practical one. Let's imagine we're in the supermarket, we're getting our groceries. How can we identify foods that are fermented, the ones that have those helpful live bacteria, as opposed to pickled foods, which might be tasty, but they don't have the helpful bacteria?
That is a great question. But to start with, it's important to know where you won't find fermented products. You won't find fermented foods with active cultures on the supermarket shelves, including all those rows of pickles and sauerkraut stored at room temperature. The only place in the supermarket you'll find products with active live cultures is in the refrigerated section.
Okay, that is really good to know. So if the shelf-stable products are not fermented, what products are fermented? How can a patient find those and be confident that they're consuming the real deal?
It can be tricky, for sure, because the only place you'll find fermented foods with active cultures is in the refrigerated section. But not all refrigerated products are fermented. It's really important to check the labels of foods like pickles and sauerkraut or kimchi to see if they explicitly list active bacteria or include the phrase live and active cultures. That's really the biggest key because some products are initially fermented but then pasteurized afterwards. And although pasteurization extends the food storage life, unfortunately, it also destroys the active cultures in the process.
So checking those labels then is really the ticket to look for live and active cultures. Okay. Can we go back and focus for a minute specifically on the fermented dairy foods that you were talking about earlier? I know the dairy section is full of all sorts of products to choose from. Some are healthy, some not so much. What do we need to know about fermentation in that whole category of dairy foods?
Sure. Yogurt and the drinkable kefir are some of the richest sources of live and active cultures. And the good news for consumers is that most brands of yogurt and kefir do contain live active cultures. But again, to be sure, check the label for a list of the active bacteria or the phrase contains live and active cultures.
Okay. So just so I'm tracking you, yogurt, kefir, and also fermented pickles and fermented sauerkraut, those are all good options as long as the label says that they have active or live cultures. Are those the main foods though, or are there other foods that patients can look for?
There are others, and some other good choices include kimchi, we've talked about, which is a traditional Korean dish made from fermented vegetables. Another is kombucha, a fermented tea that's become very popular. I'm sure you've heard about that.
Right.
Other fermented foods are miso and tempeh, both soy products. Now, miso is a traditional Japanese paste. It's often used to add flavor to soups or other dishes like rice, maybe or barley. Tempeh is made from fermented soybeans that's formed into cakes or patties. It has a nutty, kind of chewy texture and can be sautéed or baked. It's often used in place of meat for people who are looking to shift toward more plant sources of protein.
Okay, great. Those actually sound really delicious. I'm going to have to incorporate those into my rotation. So, besides checking the labels for live or active cultures on these foods, are there any caveats about any of the foods that you've mentioned? Anything that patients need to watch out for?
One more note is it's a good idea to be mindful of how much salt and sugar are part of the mix. For example, some fermented foods like pickles, kimchi, and especially miso can be pretty high in sodium, so it's best to go for the lowest sodium options. And for yogurt, kefir, and kombucha, these sometimes have a surprising amount of sugar. The manufacturer may try to offset a bit of the tartness by adding a lot of sugar. So the healthiest choices of yogurt and kefir are unsweetened and best flavored to taste with fruit or a small amount of honey.
Okay, great advice to keep an eye on both sodium and that added sugar. Steve, you've shared a ton of helpful information that I know is not common knowledge, probably to patients and probably not to clinicians either. So thank you for sharing your wisdom here. And just to recap your recommendations, then, a big one is to head to the refrigerated section of the grocery store. That's where we can find fermented foods, and to also look for labels that indicate live or active cultures. And of course, to keep an eye on that sugar and salt.
Exactly. You've got it right.
Okay, now you got me craving kimchi. Thank you so much, Steve, for helping clinicians understand more about the benefits of fermented foods and what to tell their patients. And thank you also to our listeners for tuning in. If you're a clinician who recognizes that a healthy diet is key to patient health, but you want to level up your skills at talking to patients about food and lifestyle, the nonprofit Gaples Institute has a great solution for you. It's a 4-credit CME course. It's completely self-paced and interactive. It's not just a slide deck or a video. And you can enroll right now at nutrition4docs.org. That's nutrition, FORDOCS.org. And AMA members do receive a discount. And the course also includes patient education materials that you can download and reproduce as many times as you want. So make sure to check that out. And until next time, thanks for joining us on Medicine with a Fork.